Go for it, Andy.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Inside the Music with Andy Schwartman. This is your host, Andy Schwartman. Today is a big day because this marks we are going to be talking about the 40th anniversary of one of the biggest AC/DC records that they've ever done, Back in Black. So let's get this thing going. Dang it.
I'm your producer, Senor Reed.
Oh, yeah. And
things rolling.
Okay. My bad.
To our special guest and frequent co-host, Tony Keefer. How you doing,
Yes.
Tony?
Hold on, guys.
Good to see you, brother. How familiar is that, right?
Yeah,
Right.
exactly, right?
That sound is woven into the very fabric of our society. Back in Black was released on July 25th, 1980. That's 40 years ago this month. According
Yes.
to Wikipedia, the second highest selling album of all time and the highest selling studio album by any band to date. And over 50 million copies sold and still counting. Multi-platinum certifications in over a dozen countries worldwide. For a little perspective, at the top of the show, I just want to throw this in before I let you guys start riffing back and forth. Little perspective on what the world of hard rock and heavy metal looked like at the time. Some other records released in 1980 include Kiss Unmasked, Rush Permanent Waves, Def Leppard's debut On Through the Night, Van Halen's third album, Women and Children First, Blue Oyster Cult, Cultosaurus Erectus, Crocus Metal Rendezvous, Ted Nugent Scream Dream, Cheap Trick All Shook Up, which I love. And they were still contenders at the top of the charts back then. Motorhead's Ace of Spades, you can't beat that. Along with two great records that ironically were released on the same day, Iron Maiden's debut and Judas Priest, British Steel. I also want to, let's just go from there. You guys take it from there, and we'll let our guest Tony, you go first. Share your thoughts with us about Back in Black.
Okay, well, I came into AC/DC a little bit late.
Let's go first, Andy.
Oh, I'm sorry. My bad.
No, it's all good. Yeah, I came into AC/DC too, man. I was cutting my teeth on rock and roll and, like with Aerosmith and bands like that. And I started having to check out AC/DC, and I started out with a live album. So I kind of went in a little bit reverse. I'm like, I heard all the hits and things like that, and they were great. Then I started digging into the albums. And, Back in Black obviously was a place to start because you had Back in Black and You Shook Me All Night Long, arguably two of the biggest songs. But, as you get a little bit more respect for the band and the catalog and not just the hits, you realize how great this record is. I think it's one of the albums that have the strongest B-sides ever. The hits are great, but I think the deep cuts on this album are what make it so special. And considering, at the time, a band coming out with a brand new lead singer after having success with Bon Scott, I think to me, even more than Van Halen with Sammy, I think this record is probably the best album for a band restarting. I mean, it's the best album, contender for best album ever, really, in hard rock, but considering there's a brand new lead singer, it's unbelievable.
I would have to agree. All the way.
Tony, you make an interesting point. You make an interesting point, Tony, with Brian Johnson taking over after the untimely death of the band's original vocalist, Bon Scott. And ironically, another long-standing giant in the world of heavy metal, Black Sabbath, replaced their original singer that same year, releasing Heaven and Hell, their first album with new vocalist Ronnie James Dio. So I always thought that was kind of ironic in retrospect to think in terms of AC/DC facing a total reboot and doing pretty good with it, although they were not really able to continue the kind of success they had with Back in Black. I don't know how you could. It's like trying to follow up Thriller. You can make great records. You could sell a lot of records, but there's only one Back in Black.
Right.
But Sabbath did pretty good with Dio for a few records there. And, of course, Ozzy's debut record came out that same year in the UK, although it didn't come out in the States until the following year in 81. Andy, what's your take on Brian Johnson versus Bon Scott?
I to tell you the truth, I love them both singer, as singers, but Brian, for some reason, just packs a little bit more of a punch, you know. And that's just me. That's just my opinion. All right, so don't give me any crap about that. That's my opinion. Um, but to tell you the truth, the way, okay, I this may sound silly, but let's face facts. All right, there's been a lot of chit chat about what happened with Bond, but you know what? The man did it to himself. I don't think there's any dispute or any way getting around that point. He did it to himself. You know what I'm saying? So, you know what I'm saying? I'm not saying that to be disrespectful. I'm not trying to be mean or vindictive or malicious or anything like that. I'm being honest.
Live hard, die young.
He did it to himself. Okay? People seem to think, oh, someone else was involved. No, it was him.
Yeah.
It was him.
Yeah. Totally agree.
So, yeah.
Speaking of those other records that came out that year, I thought it was interesting because I did a little research. You guys might be able to tell. Last night I was kind of making some notes for the episodes we're shooting today.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the notes I took was just reflecting on some of those other records that came out in 1980. And based on the facts, some of the great albums in the history of hard rock that came out in the late 70s and into 1980, like we're talking about today, heavy music was, some people might even say it was at its absolute peak, at the apex of heavy metal and hard rock. And the commercialization of metal would play out later in the 80s with hair bands and power ballads and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And that would push the real hard rock and metal back into the underground where it pretty much resides to this day. And that's 40 years later. Mm-hmm. Heavy metal has never really threatened the upper reaches of the charts in this country or any other since then. So Back in Black didn't just appear in a vacuum, or certainly nothing like a low point in the history of hard rock. It actually came storming into record stores and onto the radio airwaves at the time when the competition was at its absolute highest, yet it still managed to crush all other contenders. That's amazing to me.
Yeah, it is. It is. And like I said, speaking from somebody that loves classic old school, old time rock and roll, AC/DC is one of the best. Yeah. Next to Led Zeppelin and Foreigner and Fleetwood Mac and all the rest of them. Next to those people. I love those guys to pieces, but AC/DC is full of, AC/DC's music is chock full of chock full of Chuck Berry riffs and all that sort of thing.
That's true.
And I freaking love them.
Yeah, it's stuck to the formula. They never changed their formula. They never tried to be something they weren't. Now, sure, later on in some of the other albums and stuff, maybe the material got a little weaker or a little bit more whatever, but they stuck to what works for them.
Exactly.
Power chords and the big hooks, and it's AC/DC today.
True. Yeah, and I don't freaking
produced hair metal sound in those power ballads I was talking about. They never messed with that at all. So before we wrap up part one, by the way, we're going to do a three-parter on the 40th anniversary of Back in Black. I see we all wore an AC/DC t-shirt for today's episode.
Yes.
And let's let our special guest, Tony Keefer, go first, and let's talk briefly about some of our memorabilia and AC/DC artifacts and things we've collected over the years. Tony, what do you got today?
Well, I brought the album that kind of started me off on my AC/DC journey. It's AC/DC Live. You can see that or not.
Oh, nice.
This is the first album I picked up. Like I said, I was kind of cutting my teeth on the band, and I picked that up on CD, and I was blown away by it. And that kind of started my journey with AC/DC. It took me a little bit. I got start getting into the albums at that point, but luckily it was a band. I only got to see them live once, so I got my tour T-shirt from that. But I opted for Back in Black today. But I do have a tour T-shirt from them, and I have the I like to collect these little Finoco pops. I brought Angus with me today.
Nice.
So, yeah,
Very nice.
My
Very
biggest
nice.
memorabilia is reflected in my album collection and my T-shirts, of course.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing I do regret in that initial CD, I had one of those dollar bills that on the Thunderstruck tour, they would drop these dollar bills down, and they included one of those in the live CD. And to this day, I misplaced that dollar bill, and I always regret that. But
Yeah.
Yeah.
I used to have one of those too. It'd probably burn a hole in my pocket like every other dollar.
It's right.
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
Want to wrap up part 1, and then we'll ask everybody to stay tuned for part 2, right?
Yeah.
Go ahead, brother.
This is Inside the Music with Andy Schwartman. Stay tuned for, this is the end of part 1. Stay tuned for part 2.
Thanks for being with us today, Tony.
Oh, my pleasure, man. Love being here with you guys.